If workplace culture is your jam, you're in the right place. Check out this episode of Culture Secrets, the podcast dedicated to creating workplaces where both employees and the companies thrive. Welcome to the Culture Secret Podcast. I'm your host, Chelly Phillips, and this week I'm excited to introduce you to Richard Sheridan. Rich is an entrepreneur, business leader, and author, and is best known as the co-founder and CEO and chief storyteller of Menlo Innovations, a software and IT consulting firm that has earned numerous awards and press coverage for its innovative and positive workplace culture. He's also the author of Chief Joy Officer and Joy Inc., How We Built a Workplace People Love, which I highly recommend you add to your reading list. I learned about Rich from another guest you've met on my podcast, Kevin Monroe. Several years back, Kevin had a book club, and we gathered virtually and chatted about books that made an impact. Kevin even got Rich to sit in with the group and talk about his book. That book club made quite an impact. Not only did I begin thinking more intentionally about gratitude thanks to Kevin's influence, but it opened my eyes to how we view work thanks to my introduction to Rich and his work. Rich shared how he'd become disillusioned in the middle of his career. He had an all-consuming thought that things can be much better, much, much better. He wanted to know why couldn't a workplace be filled with camaraderie, human energy, creativity, and productivity. He ultimately co-founded Menlo Innovations in 2001 using a unique custom approach to custom software creation that over 3,000 people a year travel from around the world to see how they do it. He's proven that a positive and engaging leadership style can build a culture that is actually good for business. Rich and his message of joyful leadership have been featured in Forbes, Bloomberg, U.S. News and World Report, NPR's On Point podcast, NPR's All Things Considered, and the Harvard Business Review. And now he's here today on the Culture Secrets podcast. Welcome, Rich.
The first thing I wanted to bring about was, when did you realize that culture is a key element to the success of an organization?
You know, I think for me, it was a career path journey where as I went from a direct contributor as a programmer back in my early days, writing software. As I rose up the management ranks, every time I moved up the career ladder, I thought, oh, here's my chance. I can get things right now. I don't have to do all the same stupid things my boss did. And then I'd get up to that perch and everything looked different from there. Suddenly, everything looked a little more difficult. Suddenly, everything was more complicated than I thought it was. And maybe I had even a little bit of empathy for the person I was calling stupid last week, now that I'm up at the same level and get a different perspective. Along the way, I think my eternal optimist said, Rich, there's got to be a better way of doing this stuff, right? And so I was drawn to authors and books. I appreciate that you're writing a book. I've written 2 of them, and I know how impactful the right kind of books can be to change the world. The books I was drawn to were books like Peter Drucker's books on management, Peter Senge's book, The Fifth Discipline on the art and practice of building a learning organization, Tom Peters' books, all the excellence books that he wrote along the way. I could start to see this pattern because a lot of those books would basically do storytelling about other companies that had amazing results. And you could start to see the pattern of, it's about the people, the teamwork, the collaboration between those people. I don't know if the word culture back in the 80s and 90s was actually really a thing back then. Maybe it was. I was clearly yearning for creating an atmosphere of camaraderie, of human energy, of collaboration with the people who worked for me. I had moments like that every now and then. And when they happen, they're magical. And the question I kept having was, how do you get to that point and keep it there? And I think round about, 1997, I got promoted to kind of a big leadership position. I was now a VP of R&D for a public company. And my first stupid instinct at that time was just to work harder, just try harder, just do more, be more of a hero than you were, last year. And all I found out was I just got tired doing that. And then around about 1999, after a couple of years as VP and just running as hard as I could, trying to heroically move this organization forward. Because now, if anything was going wrong in the part of the company I was working for, it was on my plate. And I was never inclined to say, if we only had better people, I could get that. And I'm like, no, you're the leader. You should be able to do this. Kind of a moment happened, a click moment, literally, where I read a book, I saw a video, and I met a guy. The guy is now my co-founder here at Menlo. I brought him in as a consultant. The book was The Different Way to Organize Software Teams, which I was intrigued by. But the video is really what captured me. It was on an industrial design firm in California called IDEO. And Nightline had done this 30-minute segment on them to watch them as a team do a fictitious project to redesign the shopping cart in just 5 days, the standard wire basket shopping cart in 5 days. You can actually still watch this video. You can just go onto YouTube and Google Ted Koppel, Nightline, The Deep Dive IDEO. And if you just do that, you can watch 3 10-minute segments of this. I'm not even sure I quite realized that what I was watching was a culture. I mean, again, I'm not sure the word hit me yet, but what I saw was what I wanted. I saw this teamwork, this collaboration, the diversity of the thinkers, the energy, the innovation, the new creative ideas and everything. And I wanted that. I wanted that so, I mean, my heart was just aching for that compared to what I'd had sort of the previous almost 20 years of my career. And again, I describe my first 20 years of career as my personal trough of disillusionment, but it wasn't horrible every day. It was just that when things happened and they seemed to like clicking, and everything was working, I couldn't sustain it. Maybe it was personality based. Maybe it was partly my personality. Maybe it was my mood of the day, or it was the right combination of people, the right combination of projects or something. But I kept thinking there's got to be a better way to make this all work together, right? Like all the time, and without heroic effort for me, that I could step away for a week's vacation and not come back and have it all broken into pieces on the floor. And what happened? How'd you guys let this happen? That guy I was telling you about, James Goebel, who is now my co-founder, was a consultant. And he started, what we realized was we were reading a lot of the same books. He was going into an MBA program at night. He was a consultant I brought in to help me do some technical things with my team, but he kept throwing out these really weird ideas. And I kept saying yes. And then we watched the video together and he saw what I saw and he wanted to help me move my team into that direction. And over a 2-year period, we did it. We created this amazingly energized team that was sustainable, didn't require heroic efforts from me. It was working. It was a process. It was teamwork. It was collaboration. It was trust. And it was amazing. And then it was all taken away in an instant. 2001, the internet bubble burst and it all disappeared in an instant. Literally, I lost my job. But they couldn't take away what I had learned in those 2 years. And what I learned was you can be intentional about your culture. And one way to do that is set very clear expectations for the people who work for you. And those clear expectations aren't the typical bang your fist on the table type expectations. The expectations that we communicated was, how are you guys going to behave with each other as peers? What will your relationships be like? What are our expectations for how you treat another human being? And we crafted this. And one of the things I learned along the way through this is, and I didn't come to articulate this until just the last few years, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, that if you're going to create an intentional culture, and I'll just use my word, an intentionally joyful culture, and you don't take a deep, hard look at every traditional step of HR, and rework every one of those steps, for instance, recruiting, interviewing, selecting, onboarding, promoting, giving feedback, maybe even firing. If you don't look at all of those components and rework them to align with your cultural intentions, you'll never accomplish the goal. Your people processes must match your cultural intention. And so, for example, one of the odd things we do here, maybe the strangest thing we do here that, people are just marvel at. We get 3,000 or 4,000 visitors a year come from all over the world just to see how everything that's happening behind me actually works and how it fits together. We work 2 people to 1 computer. They work in pairs. Everybody here works in pairs. And we switch the pairs every 5 business days. So if you and I paired together for 5 days, we wouldn't pair together next week. We might come back together again later, but we're going to keep almost like square dancing. We're going to work together all day long at a computer together. So you can imagine that's a very different way of working, especially for people in the software field. We usually put programmers in what I call sensory deprivation chamber. Let them put headphones on and turn the lights down low, be really quiet because they're thinking really deep thoughts right now. And, here it's a noisy environment. People are collaborating all day long. They're talking to each other all day long. And so we thought, well, the standard interview isn't going to work, which I describe as the way I used to do it was two people sitting across the table lying to each other for a couple of hours. That was my standard interview. And then I'd make some big decision for both of us. I decide to bring you on my team. You decide to quit wherever you are and come here and work. And it's all based on a fiction, right? And then we both hope it works out, and often it doesn't. Well, here we don't ask any questions during the interview. We make it an audition. We pair two candidates with one another, and we have them work together. And we set very clear expectations from the moment of first contact. Your job is to help the person sitting next to you get a second interview. And by the way, they're competing for the same position you are. So imagine, brains are like twisting in the wind, like, what? No, I want the second interview. Why should I help this person succeed? Like, we're teaching your culture from the moment of first contact. Our expectation, our clear, we believe rational and reasonable expectation is you are here to help another human being succeed. And by the way, it's going to start right here in the interview. And if you can demonstrate good kindergarten skills, if you can play well with others, if you can support another human being, you will get invited in for the second interview. Again, lots of things to probably unpack there. But, for me, I realized people started asking when I wrote Joy Inc., that one of the famous things that just because it got repeated over and over again was these people come here from all over the world, 3,000 to 4,000 of them a year. And I believe they're coming to see what does it take to create an intentionally joyful culture. And it's the people processes. It's the actual work processes here. It's no onerous fear-based management system overloading everything. It's an overtime free culture. So we work sane work hours. So when people go on vacation, we expect them to cut themselves electronically off from the business and just enjoy time with their family or whatever they're doing. Lots of very different approaches, but all with this really focused mindset on what would it take if you wanted to create that kind of culture and enjoy the results that kind of culture produces.
One of the things you said that really stood out when you were talking about your partner now, Jay, that you brought in, you said that you kept throwing out these weird things and you kept saying yes. I think if you could kind of unpack that a little bit, because I think that what is the role of the leader of the organization when you are developing a culture, when you're trying to create this culture shift? That how do you get out of your own head saying, this is what we need versus let's try these things and see if they work?
Do you know, like the Russian Matryoshka dolls that, nest in one another after another? I think there's some element of that in this. I got really excited about some new possibilities after I saw that IDEO video. So part of my job as a leader was I had to elicit, because this was a public company, I was one of the executives out of many. There were shareholders, there was a board, there was, quarterly reports that we had to deliver to the public, all that sort of thing. So there was a great business responsibility. And we were a tech firm, and I was leading the technology part, the R&D part of the tech firm. So the majority of money that was being spent in the company was being spent on my team. They were counting, the shareholders were counting on the results my team produced. So there was a great responsibility on my part. I couldn't just wave a magic wand and say, okay, we're going to be joyful now. Still got to produce results. And I felt like I wasn't really producing the results. So I think the first element of leadership is kind of an active discontent. Just not being satisfied with what's status quo, what's normal, or simply accepting, it's just the way I always think things have to be, right? It's just the way they are. So I think that active discontent that says things can be better. I think that's a really big first moment for any leader, is to say, you know what? Now, of course, now you get to translate. Okay, great. Things can be better. How? And how are you going to do that? Right? How are you going to make the change? And what I realized the next step was I had to sell this idea to my peers on the exec team, to my boss, to the board of directors, and actually to a couple of shareholders. The next thing I had to do, and this was a learning moment for me, a big learning moment, is I had to stop talking about what I wanted, and I had to start speaking in the language of the people I was selling to. So in other words, I wanted to do some technical things with my team. I wanted to create code in a different way. My boss really didn't care about that. He wanted to see results for the corporation. And so I had to translate my vision into something that aligned with what he would support. And so that was kind of my next big moment, was when you go to create a cultural transformation, you have to turn into a salesperson. You have to communicate its value. You have to communicate why this matters to others, what results you're going to produce for them as a result of whatever culture transformation you're going to go through. Then the delightful part happened. And this is the Matryoshka doll thing. Let's talk about my boss and how he behaved. Once I broke through the barrier with him, learned to speak his language, he became my most ardent supporter. And I would say I wouldn't be talking with you today. I wouldn't have written 2 books on this idea. I wouldn't have created Menlo Innovations were it not for Bob Nero's role in my life. Because as soon as I crafted the message in a way that Bob understood, Bob did 2 things. One, he became my biggest cheerleader. And whenever I slowed down, whenever I doubted, self-doubted, because when you're making big changes, it isn't a smooth journey, and it's not a snap your fingers and everything works right tomorrow. It's a long, tough, hard journey with a lot of unknowns, and you don't know if you're succeeding or not every minute of the day. And Bob would put his gentle hand on my shoulder and he'd whisper in my ear, "You're doing the right thing, Rich. I've got you covered. Keep going." And I will tell you, I really, really needed that. So what I learned in that moment from a leadership perspective is if you have someone who's working for you, that's trying to lead some kind of big change, become their heat shield, because change agents are under attack always, because the attack is, that's not the way we do things here. You know, I was still the new kid on the block at that company, Interface Systems. I'd only been with the company for 16 years at that point. They were like, "Oh, Rich, you don't know how things go here because you've only been here for 16 years. And it was absolutely true. I was still pretty much the new kid on the block. I was the youngest executive on the team. Many of the people had been there 25, 30 years. And I, still had stuff to learn about how the company worked. That was really key. And then I think the really big moment for me happened when I brought my daughter in to work with me one day. My 8-year-old, it was a take your child to work day moment. And she was 8. She's going to watch her dad, the VP, work. And can you imagine a more boring day than that? What on earth would an 8-year-old see? Is she really going to be inspired to a career of her own by watching her dad, the VP, work, right? She cleverly and wisely brought her coloring books, crayons, and stickers and sat at my task table all day while I did the work of a VP. But at the end of the day, I thought, well, I better ask her because the teacher's going to ask her tomorrow. I said, "So, Sarah, what did you learn today?" "Oh, my." She said, "What I learned, Dad, is you're really important here." I said, "What?" She goes, "What I learned is nobody here can make a decision without asking you first." And she was absolutely right. I had created a hero-based organization. And I was the number one hero. The way I got into my position was hero-based leadership. And so I had to learn to step back from that. And I think that's another key point for a leader of a change is let your team lead. Become their heat shield, right? I had a heat shield, Matryoshka doll, right? I had a heat shield above me. I had to build a heat shield above them. I had to give them the latitude to try things, run, as we would call now here at Menlo. One of the most common phrases here is, let's run the experiment. Let's try stuff. And let's not get too upset if the stuff we try doesn't work. And what I love about the word experiment is it almost gives you permission to not succeed, because you can later say, well, yeah, it didn't work, but it was just an experiment. And I think sometimes there are simple language things we can do as leaders to diffuse the fear of trying stuff that doesn't work out. And for us, that phrase, there's three phrases we use here a lot. One is make mistakes faster. And the real emphasis is on the word faster, because nobody likes to make mistakes. But if you make them quickly and find them out when they're small, you can correct them before they kill you. Number two is let's run the experiment. So let's try new stuff. And number three is it's okay to say, I don't know. Acknowledging that there's a ton to learn. We're not going to know everything, and we're going to go run experiments and do things we don't know how to do. And that's okay. And yep, mistakes are going to happen along the way. And I think by setting ourselves up with a repeated language from leaders all the way down to front line, you create a spirit, attitude, and energy within a team that basically becomes that thing Carol Dweck talked about in her books, the growth mindset. You know, there's the difference between the people say, I can't do this, versus the people who say, I can't do this yet. And as soon as we get to the ability to add the word yet on the end of every sentence, when we say, I can't play piano yet, I'm not an artist yet, right? It opens up a whole world of possibilities in our mind. And it says, I wonder what it would take. And then I will tell you, just recently, the last year or so, I've learned an important, huge lesson about yet from my now 2, almost 3-year-old granddaughter, Colette, who we call Coco. 2-year-olds try stuff all the time, right? And she's a wild child. She climbs stuff. She does crazy things, but she keeps trying stuff. And as soon as, like, if she gets on a scooter and then she, gets it to work, right at the end, she'll go, I did it. And I watched her do this. And I thought, that is an amazingly important phrase for all human beings, because there's all this stuff that we do as humans. We're like, I got to learn how to do that. And if we just, at the end, when we tried something new and it worked, and all we got to say is, I did it. And that has actually become a mantra for me in things outside of work. I bought a pontoon boat this summer. I've never had a boat before. And you got to learn how to do things with a boat. And when I learn how to do things, I'm like, I did it. And it just is like, it's an amazing sort of release of that learning tension that happens all the time, where you're like, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to do this. I did it. Right. And it just increases your confidence for trying to learn new things, which is ultimately what I think all leaders need within their organizations. If you're going to move an organization forward, if you're going to create an intentionally positive culture, joyful culture in our world, you need people trying stuff and celebrating those small victories every step of the way.
I love that. In my first book that I did, I talk about inserting celebration into life, because we focus on get it done, get it done, get it done, get it done, get it done. And then it's on to the next thing. And you don't take that moment to really, what did I do? What did I accomplish? And let's celebrate it before we move on. I have this story in there about beating the impossible. For me, it was a half marathon. I am clearly not a runner, but I did it. And it's funny how it makes that shift in your mind, how if you beat one thing that you call impossible for you, that it becomes that, if I did that, I can do this, I can try this, I can move forward, and that kind of thing. So I just love that. I love that. I love that I did it. And I can see her in my mind just jumping around going, I'm just excited that I did it. I'm definitely going to focus on that a little bit in this.
For her, it's so natural, right? And so the question
we
for us
lose that somehow as becoming adults.
And can we get back to it? And I will just simply say, there's these things that have happened just in the past year in my life that I had to figure out how to do something I'd never figured out before. And when I switched to I did it, the learning moments became a joy, not a burden.
I love that. One of the things I hear a lot too is, like, when I'm talking with some different people about what is culture, is that they seem to confuse their mission statement with what culture is. Your culture isn't that phrase on the wall. How do leaders make that shift from, we have a culture, this is our mission, this is what we do, to really getting focused on what's happening inside the organization day to day?
I love my co-founder's definition of this. He says a culture is a summation. You remember the old summation symbol of all of the relationships inside your organization. put them all together, and that's your culture. And the way I describe it is our culture is how we choose to treat one another, right? Are we going to be mean-spirited? Are we going to be demanding and fear-based, and that becomes your culture? Or are we going to be encouraging, supportive, growth mindset? Are we going to try and focus on the personal, professional growth of our team members along the way while we're getting work done? I think, mission and vision and all that are important too, and we have those things, but you accomplish those things with the culture you've created. And quite frankly, I mean, if somehow tomorrow software development became, illegal, or just everybody figure out how to do it on their own, they won't need us anymore. We'd still have our culture, and we would look and say, so what else can we do? We could build play structures for children or something, and we'd figure out how to do it. But we would have the same culture here. Yeah. So those two are, I would say there's probably a lot of companies who can't achieve what their mission statement is or what their goals are because they don't have the culture. But when you do have the culture you want, it's particularly a positive culture, you can kind of do anything you want. You can adjust.
I know you call yourself a storyteller. And I'm a storyteller. And so I think that's a piece that gets left out sometimes as the CEO, as leaders in the organization, is what is the role of stories and how can it impact leadership? And how can stories help drive your culture and help it take root inside and keep it spreading?
One of the lines in my book is, if culture eats strategy for breakfast, famous Peter Drucker line, my belief is storytelling sets the table for that meal. Story is what connects heart to mind, body to spirit, concept to reality. Stories make it real because, like everybody says in life, it doesn't matter what you said, Shelley, it matters how it made me feel. And quite frankly, a boring PowerPoint with graphs and bars and spreadsheets and numbers, and we want to improve revenue by 3.2%, not inspiring. People kind of shrug their shoulders, say, I'm not sure how I'm involved in that. They can't picture themselves. They can't imagine the connect the dots point between what the boss just talked about with these charts and graphs and goals for the year and all that sort of thing to how should that impact me personally? But when you can translate that into a story about what, and one version of storytelling is using it to tell a story of a vision for the future. An inspiring vision. And when you do that kind of futuring storytelling, that visioning kind of process, people can start to put themselves in that picture. They can imagine where am I in that story? What contribution am I proud of that I made? Now, the stories we tell from the past should be stories of both triumph and defeat. We need to curate both stories because we need to remind ourselves, why are we here? How did we get here? What was the difficult journey that got us here? Where did we have to overcome a big obstacle? Because that's a really important thing to remember. Because a lot of times, like you say, you work, you get something done, and you just go on to the next thing, and you kind of get tired. You kind of get exhausted. Again, my co-founder has this beautiful metaphor for those moments. He says, when you're climbing the mountain and it's hard, and you get up to a certain, like a little sub peak, and the mountain's still way up here, right? Stop, turn around, look down, revel in the vision, in the scenery, revel in how much work you expended to get here, reflect on how far you've come, and then turn around and start climbing again, right? And those are the stories from the past, right? Because in that moment, what are you recounting? The success that got us to where we are today and the difficulty of the journey along the way. And that bonds people together. That shared sacrifice is what bonds us together, right? That we did this together. We did it, not just I did it. And I think that's where storytelling plays a key role. And now I will tell you here, because we get between 3,000 and 4,000 people a year travel from all over the world just to come visit us and see how all this works. Because they've read the books, they've heard about us, they want to come see it. And what do we do on the tours when they're here? We tell stories. And I used to think the stories, because I would often lead the tours because I'm not on billing work and that sort of thing. So I'd be walking people around the room telling stories. And I used to think the stories I was telling were for our guests, for the visitors, because that's why they were coming. And then I noticed something. as I'd get a team of people, group of people nearby a certain pot of tables in the space, and I'm telling stories, my team is listening. And what do? They're hearing the same stories over and over and over again. And then I realized the stories are actually holding me accountable, because I would never want anybody to come up to me after a tour on my team and say, "Hey, Rich, that company you were describing on the tour sounds amazing. Where is that place? I'd like to go there." So you darn well be better telling the truth, because otherwise they'll all be like, "Oh, it's a bunch of BS." And so there's so many facets of storytelling, but ultimately it is that most human part of us where we all want to believe, Shelley, that we are like logical, sensible, rational creatures. And we're anything but that. We are emotional. We are irrational. We are driven by our feelings far more than we are by our logic. And that's just a simple truth of humans. And so if as leaders, we are trying to get people to move with us, there's no better way to do it than a story.
What are the roadblocks that people will probably encounter when they start trying to make a culture shift? I know one of them we talked about is the attitude of that's the way it's always been. Don't break it. It's not broken. Maybe if you could, what are the 3 biggest roadblocks that you might encounter as you're trying to create a culture shift inside your organization?
Well, I think number one, the belief that, you can just click your fingers, you can put up a poster, you can do a rah-rah speech once a year, and that somehow is going to change your culture. Culture change is, we have a poster here at Menlo that says, technology changes quickly, people change slowly. And then another poster that says, people don't resist change, they resist being changed. And one of the reasons people resist any kind of change is because it threatens an existing reward system, right? And I'm not talking about compensation. That is the least effective kind of reward system. What's my job? What's my title? What's my span of authority? Can I tell people I'm working really hard today? Can I tell them I'm working crazy overtime hours and they can't live without me and all this kind of stuff, right? Which ultimately isn't healthy for an individual, but it's still a reward. I work on really crappy projects and I work on them all day long and I work on them through the weekend. And it sounds awful, but there's this reward of like, I'm the only one who can do it. And so when you start messing with how things work, you have to understand you are actually pulling rewards away from people. And as Janine LaMarche says in her famous book, Changing the Way We Change, if you don't replace the existing reward that you just took away with a reward of equal or greater value, people will revert to the old way of doing things, even if it's pain-filled. And so, I think and then finally, the thing you and I just discussed, which is, somebody reads my book, somebody reads your book, somebody goes to a conference where one of us speaks, somebody speaks to a colleague and they get a brand new idea and they go running up to the first person they know in the organization who hasn't heard what you heard, hasn't thought what you thought, hasn't read what you've read. And you grab them like, I have this great new idea. And they're like, well, I won't work here. We tried that 10 years ago. It didn't work then. It won't work now. And when I arm people with the response, because I think sometimes having a pre-programmed response is really valuable. I tell them, I said, look them in the eye and say, I get it, but let's try it before we defeat it. Let's run the experiment and let's see what happens.
One thing with the book that I want to really accomplish is that culture change does not have to start at the CEO level. It can start inside your cubicle, whether it's you and your coworker, whether it's you and your team. What advice would you have for someone who might not be in a quote unquote leadership role at the organization? If they want to see a culture shift, how can they get it started? I know you mentioned one thing about learning to speak the language of who you're trying to convince. I love that. And I think that kind of applies there too. But what else would you tell them to encourage them or maybe show them that a culture shift can start occurring at any level of an organization?
Hardest place to start is the easiest place to identify a beginning spot. And it's in here. Humbly admit you have to change. Start the change inside of you first. That 8-year-old who told me you're the most important person here, nobody can make a decision without you. Guess who had to change? I had to change. And I always tell people, you don't have to change the world, because that's where people get stuck. That's another place culture change. Oh my gosh, we're so big, we're so old, we're so bureaucratic, we're so regulated. There's no way. I mean, it's just ginormous. And I always tell them, you don't have to change the world. You just have to change your world. Change you. Be a different person when you walk in the door tomorrow. Greet people with a hearty good morning. Bring a positive attitude. Assume good intention on the people around you. And then start to change the people around you. Invite them into your world. Say, hey, you know what? We can't change anybody else, but let us be this, band of brothers and sisters who can, start to change our little world here. And what's interesting that happens is you begin to be the change you want to see in the world, and then people want to be more like you.
Truly appreciate your time today. And this has been a great conversation. I know you're busy. I know people are always clamoring for your time. And I appreciate the fact that you took some to spend it with me today.
Well, I think maybe that's my final bit is, I think if each of us adopted an attitude and an energy that says, you know what, I'm going to leave the world a better place than I found it, we find a way to make time for others and to inspire others with our journey, which is what you're doing and is what I'm doing, working with you on this. Because somehow our conversation today is going to change somebody's life in a way that you and I would have never anticipated, which is the joy of being an author, I think.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Culture Secrets podcast. There were so many golden nuggets of advice here, I don't think I can pick just one from Rich. I hope you got a list full as well, too. If you have comments or questions, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter. If you like what you heard, I'd love it if you'd subscribe, drop me a rating, and share the link with a friend. I'm currently booking for corporate training and workshop presentations. I'd love the chance to work with you or your company. If you're interested, please visit my website at www.chellyphillips.com. That's CHELLIEPHILLIPS.com. And remember, building a value culture is your competitive advantage and the backbone of any successful organization.